The public, in the meantime, very much disappointed and unhappy over everything. They had gotten rid of one nuisance and gotten another in its place, decided that the great experiment of democracy in England was a failure. So they called Charles II to the throne, and he arrived in the midst of this tremendous conflict between the royalists and the republicans, or what might be termed the conservatives and the progressives. Charles started out with almost everything against him. But he was a more prudent man. It occurred to him that one of the secrets of success, as he regarded the career of Charles I thoughtfully, was to win the approval of the people. He might have his peculiar foibles, but he had to also represent them to some degree. He had to do something for them, and was fortunate enough to realize this fact. He was a scholar, much more so than his predecessors, and among his first public acts was to establish the Royal Society of London, which became the basis of scientific advancement in England for nearly 200 years, and included such men as Newton and other progressives in its list of members. The Royal Society was a success. It was built on the basis of Bacon's contributions to learning and dedicated to him. But Charles gradually, Charles II, gained control of the situation. He was in very difficult times at first, but after a while the English people settled back and accepted him, and he became comparatively popular. Now, what all this has to do with Milton is maybe not obvious at first, but remember that Milton was campaigning for Cromwell. Now, when Cromwell's party lost, the Lord Protector ceased to be important, and the Royalists returned in Charles II. Milton found himself in extremely difficult situations. He was picked out as being one of the rabble-rousers of the Commonwealth. He was prosecuted and persecuted. In fact, he was temporarily imprisoned. He was on the wrong side of the political situation, and this caused him a great deal of trouble. His pamphlets were publicly burned, and as far as his political career was concerned, Milton was finished. But this had very little effect upon his literary advancements. Actually, he was a poet of outstanding abilities, and in spite of the difficulties politically, he was finally given a chair at Oxford, and was at that time also able to attain a considerable scholastic reputation. He had also, in the meantime, managed to get his master's at Cambridge. So as education went, he was in a comparatively secure position, but his popularity rose and fell every day. And in the midst of this, the great problem of his life set in. His eyesight failed. As a result of that, he remembered back to the time when he first began to see these light flashes in his eyes. Little by little, his sight became poorer. He had given practically his entire eyesight to research and study. He was an avid reader, a good scholar, and a good thinker, but his eyes had been not strong from early life, and by the time that he was through with his political career, John Milton was blind. He was completely blind. This, however, seems to have had very little effect upon his career. Having been finally liberated from political involvements, he settled down to the great work of his life, and that was the writing of his heroic poem on the biblical subject, Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained. Paradise Lost was practically a summary of the opening chapters of Genesis. It was based entirely upon the Protestant interpretation of the early parts of the Old Testament. There were certain additions, however, that arose from Milton's basic scholarship. He was well aware of the ancient legends of the Jewish people. He was conversant with Greek and Roman antiquities, theology, and theogony. He was more or less aware of the contemporary thinking of scholars of his own time, and when he visited Rome, he met and discussed his problems with another blind man, Galileo. So he moved in a good intellectual circle, but now in his older years he turned his attention directly to the cultivation of a great religious epic that he hoped would have lasting effect upon human society. Actually, at this time also, he had a family in which, again, tragedies were numerous. His first wife died, leaving him with 3 children. His second wife, whom he adored, died in childbirth. And all through his life, his conditions were uncertain. He was, however, fairly well cared for by a third wife and the children, who had by this time grown up. But the children were not happy over the conditions in the family, because Newton had transformed his daughters into amanuenses. They had to take all of his verses and write them. He dictated to them morning, noon, and night for years, which was a little difficult upon young girls growing up. So it's understandable that they did not entirely appreciate the extreme severity of their father. Any question, any doubt, any uncertainty met a tremendous anger from John. He did not believe that anything could take the place or equal in importance or should be permitted to interfere with a labor dedicated to the glory of God. So his children became absolutely important to him, necessary to him. But he continued to feel that behind everything that he did was a pressure that was more than earthly. He used the medium of poetry in the presentation of his work, which was, of course, also the popular medium of nearly all of the early literary lights of the 17th century. He was in the same group as the earlier Greek poets. There was something about his work that showed that he was well versed in the Odyssey and Iliad of Homer. He was also well equipped in the study of Hesiod. He was like many of the later men, like Dryden, who made a poetic translation of the Aeneas and Virgil, and of course Dante, whose Divine Comedy was given in verse. The great epics of that time were nearly always in poetic form. There was a tremendous vocabulary involved in this procedure, and it is amazing that any person unable to see would be able to continue to call upon the internal resources of his mind sufficiently to be able to dictate these very complicated expressions with the most involved use of unusual English terms. In any event, however, the work was a success from the standpoint of the original intent. As a reward for his labor of months and years in the preparation of Paradise Lost, Milton was rewarded financially by a publisher who gave him about £20 for the entire work. In other words, Milton didn't care. He wasn't interested in money. This is one very strong point in his favor. He made practically nothing out of any of his versifications. But that pleased him all right. He was not at all embittered by it. But Paradise Lost became so popular that between the years 1700 and 1800, there were over 100 editions. At the same time, there were only a dozen editions of Shakespeare. Now, in those days, Milton's poem had a very wide circulation because it touched into the religious life of the people very intimately. It was almost like reading the Bible, and to many people Milton became another prophet. The Old Testament has to do, of course, with that part of the life of our ancestors from the creation of the world to the flood of Noah. And this was the area upon which the Milton prepared and wrote his Paradise Lost.